Hey there! Tonight, we're not walking through castles or battlefields. We're walking through gardens. Small ones, rough, scratched into the earth by hand. Not the kind you see in royal paintings, but the kind that kept people alive. We're talking about vegetables, the forgotten kind. Because medieval peasants didn't survive on meat or fine bread or wine. They survived on roots, leaves, things that grew in the cold mud behind their huts. Things you've probably never heard of. Some were bitter, some barely edible, all of them essential. This isn't just a list. It's a story of how people got through the hunger months with dirt under their nails and hope buried in the soil. So if slow, quiet history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And if you're still listening by the end, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. There's something quietly powerful about knowing you're not the only one falling asleep to the same simple stories. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's open the gate to a medieval garden most people forgot ever existed. Let's begin. Skirret, the sweet root that disappeared. You wouldn't recognize it at first glance. It looks like a bundle of pale, tangled roots, thinner than carrots, longer than parsnips, dusty, crooked, awkward. The kind of thing you'd expect to find forgotten in the corner of a root cellar. But for medieval peasants, skirret wasn't strange. It was survival. Skirret, Sium cicerum if you want the old Latin, is one of those vegetables that time left behind, native to Central Europe and once prized across monasteries and village plots. It was a staple before the New World ever sent over a potato. The root was sweet. Not sugar sweet, but a subtle kind of sweet. Somewhere between a carrot and a salsify. Soft when cooked, but fibrous, almost peppery when raw. Peasants knew it well. They grew it in raised beds in hard soil, anywhere that wasn't already claimed by rye or barley. It didn't ask for much. No fancy care. No perfect weather. Just water, patience, and a little space to tangle its roots deep into the ground. In lean winters, skirret was a blessing. You could boil it with a bit of garlic and wild leek, roast it over embers, mash it into porridge. The monks called it the sweet root of the humble. And in a world where sweetness was rare and expensive, it mattered. It didn't keep well, though. That's part of why it vanished. When potatoes arrived centuries later, easier to grow, easier to store, skirret was quietly pushed aside. It wasn't flashy. It didn't look good on a merchant's table. It didn't ship well or scale up. So it faded. But in the Middle Ages it filled bellies, quietly, faithfully. And if you walked into a peasant's hut on a cold March night, the smell of skirret simmering in a pot, sweet, earthy, faintly herbal, might be the closest thing to comfort they had. It wasn't glamorous, it was enough. And sometimes that's what survival looks like. Good King Henry, the poor man's asparagus. It sounds like a joke, a vegetable named after a king, but there was nothing royal about it. Good King Henry wasn't eaten by nobles. You wouldn't find it in banquet halls or embroidered cookbooks. It grew in hedgerows near fences, beside dung heaps and stone walls, where the soil was disturbed and no one else bothered to plant. And yet, for peasants, it was green gold. The Latin name, Blightum bonus henricus, was known in monastic gardens and village edge plots. The leaves looked like fat spinach, the stems thick and hollow. When it first sprouted in spring, it gave hungry families what they'd been waiting for all winter, something fresh. The leaves could be boiled, fried in animal fat, shredded into pottage, or packed into a doughy dumpling. They were slightly bitter, heavy with iron. Not exactly tasty, but dependable. And the shoots? Those were the real treasure. Cut in early spring, before they went woody, the shoots of good King Henry were tender and mild. Peasants called them poor man's asparagus. And that wasn't just folk poetry, it was survival. A few handfuls of those green spears in the stew pot could turn water and barley into something that actually felt like a meal. It was a perennial too. Once you planted it, it kept coming back, quietly, faithfully, like the people who depended on it. Of course, it's mostly forgotten now. Its bitterness turned people away once spinach and modern greens came into favour. You won't find it in supermarkets, only in seed catalogues whispered among foragers and historical gardeners. But back then, it was hope, pushing up through the frost. It was one of the first greens after the hunger months, one of the first signs that the earth was waking up again. And even though it bore a king's name, it didn't belong to palaces. It belonged to hands too callous to write, but clever enough to plant. Alexander's, the green that waited by the sea. You probably wouldn't plant it on purpose today. Its flavour is strange, somewhere between celery, parsley and black pepper. But in the Middle Ages, Alexander's was everywhere, growing wild along coastal paths, lining the edges of monasteries, poking through the cracks of stone walls with that bold, dark green that meant something edible was nearby. The Latin name, Smyrnium olusatrum, but peasants didn't care about Latin. They called it what they needed it to be. Alexander's, wild parsley, sea celery, or just food. It wasn't glamorous, but it grew in places other things didn't. Salt-sprayed cliffs, crumbling ruins, roadsides. It was one of the few green things tough enough to rise in early spring and not wither under cold wind. And peasants learned fast, if it's green and it doesn't poison you, you eat it. Alexander's gave you options. You could eat the stalks, thick and hollow like celery with a spicy bite. You could simmer the leaves in broth, crush the seeds into flavouring, even nibble the roots raw if hunger pressed hard enough. It was a whole plant of possibility. In kitchens, it added heat to bland grain stews. In sick rooms, it was brewed into bitter teas for coughs and stomach aches. And in the fields, it was simply picked and chewed, leaf by leaf, because it was there. Some called it the parsley of the poor. Some didn't call it anything at all. They just ate it. Over time, it disappeared. When true celery arrived, when parsley grew softer and taste buds forgot how to handle bitterness, Alexander's faded. It was too strong, too wild, too peasant. But back then, it was green when nothing else was. It stood when other crops failed. It waited patiently by the sea and said, "I'm still here." And for a hungry peasant with nothing but salt in the air and stone underfoot, that was enough. Rampaion, the root beneath the folk tales. You've probably heard of it, but only through a story. A garden behind a wall, a pregnant woman craving greens, a stolen plant, a witch, a tower. The name of the girl, Rapunzel. But before it was a fairy tale, Rampion was dinner. Campanula rapunculus, a modest little plant with bell-shaped flowers and a root that looked like a small white carrot. Grown in cottage gardens and wild pastures. Not flashy, not popular now. But back then, it mattered. Rampion gave you two gifts, the root and the leaf. The root was small but sweet, crisp when raw, tender when boiled. You could roast it with onions, mash it into pottage, or stew it into whatever barley and water hadn't already swallowed. It wasn't filling on its own, but it made the filling things better. The leaves were mild, like lamb's lettuce, used fresh when they could be, boiled when they had to be. They appeared early in spring when winter cabbages had withered and the hunger had stretched too long. In poor households, Rampion was grown tucked between other crops, between beets and leeks, near the edges of paths, not for show, for use. And yes, the name lived on, through stories, through superstition. Some believed it brought health to mothers, strength to newborns. Maybe that's why the fairy tale picked it. Or maybe someone just remembered that, long ago, people were willing to risk everything to pull something tender from the soil, even if it grew in someone else's garden. Rampion eventually vanished, It didn't scale well, didn't keep. Supermarkets had no room for it, and new vegetables offered more calories per square inch. But it fed people when the world was still sharp and narrow, when food came from 10 steps outside your door, or not at all. A fairy tale route. Not because it was magic, but because it was real, and people forgot it, as they forget all the best things they no longer need. Sea beet, the wild grandparent of modern greens. It grew where the land met the water, on salty coasts, wind-blasted dunes, the ragged edges of fields where the soil was half sand, half sea. Most crops couldn't survive there, but sea beet didn't just survive, it thrived. Before chard, before spinach, before sugar beets or Swiss greens, there was sea beet. Beta vulgaris subsp. Maritima. It didn't look like much, low to the ground. Shiny green leaves, sometimes tinged red. The roots were thin and tough, not worth eating. But the leaves, those were life. Peasants near the coast picked them daily in spring and early summer. Not because they were delicious, they were earthy, slightly salty and tough if picked too late, but because they were there. They filled stews, balanced fish, wrapped meat, gave colour to the grey bowl of every evening. Sea beet was wild, but it wasn't wild to the people who depended on it. They knew how to coax it, how to cut it without killing the plant, how to find it in the dunes after storms, when the tide rolled back just enough. In lean years it fed whole families. In good years it flavoured what little they had. You could fry it with lard, mash it into oats, or let it wilt in hot broth over coals. It was one of the first greens to come back after winter, and often the last to disappear before snow. But slowly it was domesticated, crossed with other plants, changed, grown sweeter, larger, easier. It became beetroot, sugar beet, chard, and sea beet. Rugged, wild, dependable was forgotten. But it's still there, still growing on cliffs and coastlines, still waving its broad, shiny leaves in the salty wind, a quiet survivor. The plant that taught us how to grow food from sand and brine. And even if no one thanks it anymore, it doesn't mind. It just keeps growing. Because some vegetables don't need fame, they just need space. Parsnip tops, the leafy green. No one talks about, you've probably seen parsnips. That pale carrot-like root buried in supermarket shelves between turnips and sweet potatoes. Creamy, sweet when roasted, a little old-fashioned. But in the Middle Ages, peasants didn't throw away the tops. They ate them. That's the 6th forgotten vegetable, not the root, but the parsnip greens. Today you'd be told not to eat them. Too bitter, people say. Slightly toxic, say others. And yes, raw they're harsh, fuzzy, astringent, not pleasant in a salad. But when you have nothing, you don't wait for pleasant. You wait for edible. Parsnips were prized in the Middle Ages. Before sugar was common, they were one of the sweetest things you could grow. The roots were boiled, roasted, mashed into pottage. But the greens, they were early spring gold. Peasants picked them young, before the fuzz thickened, before the bitterness hardened. They boiled them, sometimes twice, drained them, fried them in lard if they had it, mixed them with oat flour and salt, and they lived another day. The leaves were high in vitamins they didn't have a name for. They couldn't tell you about antioxidants, but they could tell you that your joints hurt less when you ate greens in the spring. And this was one of the few that grew back again and again, even after harvest. The trick was knowing when to pick them, how to cook them, what to pair them with to make them taste almost like something you wanted. Sometimes garlic, sometimes nettles, sometimes just heat and patience. Eventually, as tastes changed and wealth grew, people started throwing the tops away. They forgot the rules, forgot how to make them safe, forgot they were even food. But in a medieval village, nothing was wasted. The root filled your belly, the leaves kept you alive, and both were pulled from the same patch of muddy earth, with the same hands, cold, cracked, hopeful. Because peasants didn't have the luxury of picky eating, they had the wisdom of use, and the will to make everything matter. Woad leaves, not just for paint. Most people know woad as a dye, that deep, ghostly blue you've seen in paintings of ancient warriors or medieval face markings. That came from woad, Isatis tinctoria, a tough little plant with yellow flowers and a root that digs deep into poor soil. But what you probably don't know is this. Peasants ate it too. Not the whole thing, not the root or the seed, just the young leaves. Because in the late winter, when pickings were slim and spring hadn't yet unpacked its green baggage, woad was one of the few things still clinging to life near the edge of the field. And hunger doesn't care what a plant is meant for, it cares what it can be. Woad leaves were bitter, very bitter. But when boiled, and boiled again, and maybe boiled a third time, they lost their bite enough to be swallowed with some coarse rye bread and a little salt. You wouldn't serve them to a guest. You wouldn't even write them down in a recipe. But they kept people going. They were the kind of food you didn't brag about, just quietly relied on. And like so many peasant vegetables, they grew where they weren't wanted. On the edge of flax fields, in ditches, along stone fences that marked invisible lines between one poor family's plot and another. Eventually, woad was pushed out by better dye plants. Indigo was stronger, richer, easier to harvest. And once sugar and trade brought variety to the European table, no one bothered boiling blue dye plants for dinner anymore. But for a long time, woad was part of survival. Part of a world where even a plant that stained hands and shirts was still, in the right light, food. A bitter meal, a last resort. But not the worst thing you'd eat that week, because medieval peasants knew something modern life sometimes forgets. Food isn't just about flavour, it's about function. Fat hen, the weed that fed the fields. It grows everywhere, by accident, in corners of fields, between rows of real crops, in cracks between stones beneath the edge of thatched roofs, beside fences and wells. Today we call it a weed, but in the Middle Ages, peasants called it food. Fat hen, also known as Chenopodium album or wild spinach, was one of the most widely eaten greens across medieval Europe. Not because it was planted, not because it was pretty, but because it didn't need to be. It simply showed up. And in a world where hunger was seasonal, constant and cruel, anything green that showed up without asking for space was a gift. Fat hen's leaves are small and dusted with a strange white coating that makes them look almost silver. They're soft when young and packed with nutrients: calcium, iron, vitamins A and C. The kind of things peasants didn't know by name, but knew in their bones made them feel stronger. When picked early, it was tender enough to eat raw, mixed into oat cakes, tossed with vinegar. More often, though, it was boiled down and stirred into pottage. A few handfuls turned grain mush into something hearty, something vaguely hopeful. The seeds, too, were useful, ground into flour or toasted, though harvesting them was a slow, fussy process. Still, nothing was wasted. It was called fat hen, not because hens ate it, though they did, but because people believed it made hens plump, and did the same for people. But eventually, fat hen was displaced. New crops, cleaner fields, a war on weeds, and slowly, the knowledge disappeared. How to find it, when to pick it, how to tell good leaves from bad ones, how to cook it so it nourished rather than punished. Today it's something gardeners rip out and curse, but back then it was a quiet ally, an uninvited guest that fed the poor, a weed only because it had no voice to claim more. Peasants knew better. Sometimes the best crops are the ones that don't need planting at all. Salsify. the root that tasted like oysters. It's not much to look at. A pale, scraggly root, thin, hairy, gnarled, the kind of thing you'd mistake for a weed if you didn't know better. But peel it, boil it, roast it, and it gives you something unexpected, a faint taste of oysters. That's why medieval peasants sometimes called salsify the oyster plant. Of course, most of them had never tasted an oyster, but the flavour still mattered, rich, nutty, smooth, a little exotic in a world where food was usually grey and bitter. Salsify, Tragopagon porifolius, grew slow but steady. It liked cool weather, didn't mind poor soil. You planted it in late spring, forgot about it for most of the year, then pulled it from the ground just as winter arrived. The roots kept well, that alone made it valuable. Peasants stored them in cellars, buried in straw, waiting for the months when the fields were frozen and all the cabbages had rotted at the edges. When hunger pressed close and meat was gone, a pot of boiling salsify, soft, earthy, creamy, felt like relief. They used it in pottage mostly, or fried it flat in ash cakes, sometimes mashed with vinegar and onion if they had it. The leaves could be eaten too early in the season, sharp and green like chives, but it was the root they waited for. Monks grew it in cloister gardens. Healers recommended it for coughs and fevers. Mothers gave it to sick children when nothing else would stay down. And yet, like so many peasant foods, it vanished. Too slow for modern farming, too ugly for markets, too forgotten for cookbooks. But in the mud and smoke of medieval life, it was dependable. It sat beneath the soil, waiting. Not flashy, not famous, just enough. And when enough is all you have, a bowl of warm salsify is as close as you'll get to comfort. Even if it still tastes like the sea you've never seen. Nettle, the stinging leaf that healed and fed. You've probably brushed past it and regretted it. That sharp tingle, the rash that follows, the sting that lingers. But medieval peasants didn't avoid nettles. They harvested them. Because if you knew what you were doing, stinging nettle, Urtica dioica, wasn't a nuisance. It was dinner. And sometimes it was the best one you'd have all week. The trick was simple. You wore gloves. You picked the youngest leaves, tender, bright green, still curled from the bud. You didn't eat them raw, you boiled them or crushed them, or soaked them long enough to soften the sting. Then you ate. Nettle had flavour, a rich, earthy green taste, somewhere between spinach and cucumber, but deeper. It could turn a pot of barley water into soup. Mixed with garlic, it tasted like spring. With onions, it tasted like patience. But it wasn't just flavour. Nettle was power. It was packed with iron, calcium, vitamin C. Things no peasant could name, but knew they needed. It gave back energy after a long winter. Helped with aching joints. Slowed bleeding when used as a poultice. Stimulated hair growth when boiled into a rinse. It was food. It was medicine. It was thread. Yes, nettles could be spun into rough cloth if nothing else grew. The entire plant was useful. And because it grew everywhere, in ditches, beside barns, at the edges of fields, it never really ran out. Of course, nobles didn't eat nettles, not unless they were sick or curious or pretending to be humble. But for peasants, it was routine. You didn't tell stories about it. You didn't write it in letters. You just picked it, cooked it, ate it, and quietly thanked the sting that reminded you it was still alive. Because when the cupboard was bare and the field was slow, nettle was the one thing that never asked permission to grow. It just did. And for that, peasants called it a weed, but also a gift. Cow parsnip, the giant green you had to handle carefully. It towered above most wild plants, thick-stemmed, leafy, broad as a man's forearm, and to the untrained eye it looked dangerous, because sometimes it was. But medieval peasants didn't fear cow parsnip. They cooked it. Caution first, Cow parsnip, Heracleum spondylium, has powerful sap. Touching it raw in the sun could burn your skin, but if you knew how to handle it, knew when to harvest it, and how to prepare it, it were one of the most reliable green vegetables a medieval family could find. The key was youth. Before the stems grew woody, before the flowers unfolded into giant white umbrellas, you cut the young stalks, peeled the outer layer, boiled them fast, blanched again if needed, then cooked them like leeks or celery. What did it taste like? Mild, slightly sweet, a little earthy, a cross between asparagus and artichoke, and more importantly, it filled you up. You could stuff it, fry it in goose fat if you had any, toss it into a pot of old turnips and stale ale, and suddenly, dinner. Some regions dried it, others fermented the stems, and some just took the leaves and cooked them to death in salted broth until they lost the bitterness. Cow parsnip wasn't just food, it was survival with a warning label. Handled right, it fed you. Handled wrong, it hurt you. But peasants knew the line. They taught it to their children the same way they taught fire safety or how to bind a bleeding hand. This one plant, easy to find, hard to master, stood between hunger and a very rough season. And like so many wild greens, it eventually vanished from the diet. Too risky, too complicated, too easy to mistake for its deadly cousin, giant hogweed. But in the days before industrial farms and grocery shelves, when every green mattered and the line between food and danger was thin, cow parsnip was a gamble worth taking, because the plant that could burn your skin might also warm your belly. Turnip greens, the top half that saved winters. Everyone remembers the root. Big, white, round, turnips-filled bowls and bellies for centuries, boiled into pottage mashed with leeks, eaten until you swore you'd never touch one again. But few remember the leaves, and that's where the secret was, because turnip greens were the part of the plant that grew fast. You didn't have to wait months. Just a few weeks after planting, they were ready. Tender, sharp, peppery. The first thing you ate while waiting for the real crop to swell underground. In the medieval world, where every calorie counted and winter refused to let go, turnip tops were the difference between weakness and strength. You harvested them young, cut them low to the ground, but not so deep the roots stopped growing. It was a delicate balance. Eat too many greens, and the turnip beneath would stunt. Eat too few, and you went hungry waiting. They weren't glamorous, just chopped into stews, or fried in a spoonful of fat if the pig had given you one. Maybe stirred into yesterday's barley gruel with salt and vinegar. That was enough. Turnip greens were common, so common they were beneath mention. The rich never asked for them. The poor didn't write them down. They were just there, everywhere, in monastery gardens, village plots, war-torn fields where the only thing left to grow was something that could survive neglect. And the best part, they kept coming back. If the weather held, you could cut a patch 3-4 times before the root came out. More if you didn't mind bitter stems. Eventually, as turnips fell from favour and new vegetables took their place, the greens were forgotten. Or worse, discarded. But for medieval peasants, they were half the plant, half the meal, and sometimes half the hope. The part you didn't notice until there was nothing else. Angelica, the herb that was almost a vegetable. It smelled like medicine. Tall, hollow stems, broad leaves, umbrella flowers that looked like fireworks frozen in green. And for medieval peasants, Angelica was more than a herb. It was a lifeline. Most people today know Angelica as a flavouring, something that lives in old books of botany and obscure liqueurs. But back then, it was a root, a stem, a shoot, something you could actually chew when winter hadn't ended yet, but your hunger had already begun. Angelica grew wild across northern Europe. It loved damp places, riverbanks, bog edges, the back corner of a monastery garden. It was hardy, frost-tolerant, patient. and every part of it had a use. The young stalks were peeled and boiled like celery, slightly sweet, slightly bitter, chewy and aromatic. You could candy them if you had honey, but more often they went straight into the pot. Thickened broths, balanced salt pork, added something green to the sea of beige food that made up most medieval meals. Peasants also used the leaves sparingly, less for flavour, more for health. They didn't talk about vitamins or anti-inflammatories. They just said it kept the death away, and they meant it. During plagues, Angelica was chewed raw, steeped into tea, tied in bundles and hung above doors. A ward against bad air or bad luck or whatever else they couldn't see but knew was coming. It was sacred to some, magical to others, but always useful. It wasn't the tastiest vegetable, or the softest, or even the safest. Too much could upset your stomach, but it had presence, substance, something deep and grounding that made you feel like the earth hadn't given up on you. In time, Angelica faded from the plate, pushed aside by more modern herbs, and forgotten as a food altogether. But for centuries it stood tall in the garden, not just as seasoning, but as sustenance, something you could eat when everything else had already been eaten. Sorrel, the green that bit back. Some vegetables fill you, some comfort you, and then there's sorrel, sharp, sour, and impossible to ignore. It's not a vegetable most people think about now, but in the medieval world, Rumex acetosa, common sorrel, was one of the first things to push up through cold spring soil. And when it came, peasants listened, because sorrel didn't just grow, it dared to grow. Fast, fearless, bright green with leaves shaped like tiny spears. The taste was shocking, like lemon before lemons were common, like vinegar trapped in a leaf, like something alive and a little wild. Peasants called it sour dock. They didn't grow it, they foraged it, in meadows, at field edges, beside streams where nothing else seemed edible. It didn't need tending, it didn't ask permission, and that made it perfect. You couldn't eat much of it raw, too acidic, but in soups it shone. A bowl of lentils and barley becomes something else when a handful of sorrel is stirred in. It cuts through the fat of bacon scraps, brightens flat bread, brings colour and tang to a meal otherwise dulled by months of root vegetables and dried grain. And it helped. The peasants didn't have words for it, but sorrel was packed with vitamin C. It helped stave off scurvy, cleared the taste of illness from the mouth, made people feel, if only for a moment, like they'd tasted spring. Sometimes it was crushed into a sauce, sometimes boiled to tame it, sometimes mixed with nettles, leeks, or wild garlic into a thick green porridge that didn't look like much, but might have been the most refreshing thing anyone had eaten in weeks. Eventually, sorrel got left behind, too sharp for modern tastes, too wild for clean farms. It became a garnish, or a forgotten weed, or something only herbalists cared to name. But to medieval peasants, it was clarity, a zing of life in a world shaped by mud and smoke, the kind of food that reminds you you're still here, still tasting, still awake. Field beans, the humble pulse that saved lives. They weren't flashy, they weren't soft or sweet, but they were there, season after season, storm after storm. Field beans, also known as fava beans or broad beans, were the quiet giants of the medieval garden. And to the peasant scraping through another late winter, they were more than just food. They were foundation. Unlike the tender green beans we eat today, field beans were dense, hearty, the kind of crop that could take a cold snap and still rise. They grew low and tough, with pods like leather and seeds like stones until properly cooked. But cooked they were, boiled in stews, mashed with salt and oil, fried into rough patties, mixed with barley or rye to make dense, heavy loaves of peasant bread. There was no end to the ways a desperate cook could stretch a sack of beans. and they filled you in a way greens never could, because field beans were protein, sustained labour, something you could eat at dawn and still feel in your belly by sunset. They gave strength to dig, to haul, to walk miles to market or hours behind a plough. But here's the part most people forget. They weren't just food for people. They were food for land. Field beans fixed nitrogen in the soil. Planting them restored fertility. Letting them rot back into the ground was as important as harvesting them. In a world without synthetic fertilizer, they were part of the cycle that made survival possible. Peasants didn't know the chemistry, but they knew this. If you grew beans this year, you could grow something else next year. And if you had a pot of them in the hearth, you didn't go to sleep hungry. Eventually, newer crops took their place. Softer ones, sweeter ones. And field beans became feed, livestock fodder, forgotten. But once they were the difference between life and starvation. Not elegant, not rare, just dependable. And in the Middle Ages that made them sacred, because sometimes the most powerful vegetables are the ones no one notices, until they're gone. And now we've reached the end of the row. The garden gate swings closed behind us, and we leave behind the tangled beds, the rough-hewn paths, the scent of earth and smoke and bitter leaves. 15 forgotten vegetables, 15 pieces of survival, none of them glamorous, none of them painted into royal feasts or remembered in fairy tales, except maybe once, in the shape of a stolen rampion. These weren't the crops of wealth, they were the crops of need, planted in soil too thin, grown in seasons too short, harvested by hands too tired to dream of anything more than warmth and calories. And yet, they fed people, year after year, storm after storm, famine, plague, war, winter. These vegetables didn't promise joy, they promised continuance, and sometimes that was everything. What's beautiful about these plants is how little they asked in return. A few inches of poor dirt, a bit of rain, a corner of a hedge. They weren't ornamental, they weren't bred to be sweet or soft or easy to sell. They were resilient, just like the people who ate them. The medieval peasant didn't have the luxury of waste. Every stem mattered, every root, every green shoot in spring was noticed, remembered, passed down. Pick the sorrel early. Boil the nettles twice. Save the field beans for the second frost. There were no cookbooks, no menus, just knowledge, lived, tried, shared, and then, over time, forgotten. Not because these vegetables failed us, but because we stopped needing them. New foods came, more profitable ones, softer ones, crops that shipped better, looked better, yielded more. And in that shift, we lost something. Not just flavour, but memory. We forgot what hunger tasted like. We forgot what survival required. And that's what this video was about. Not nostalgia, but recognition. A small nod to the generations who lived not through conquest, but through careful digging, through gathering greens from between stones, through boiling bitter leaves into something warm and vaguely filling. These vegetables didn't feed legends, they fed everyone else. And if you're still listening, thank you. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. It's strangely comforting to imagine all of us, scattered across the map, dozing off to the same slow story of soil and survival. And if this quiet kind of history helped you relax, consider liking the video and subscribing. Not because algorithms need it, but because you might want more moments like this. Simple, slow, human. Now rest. The fire's low, the pot is empty, the garden is sleeping. You've made it through another season, and you're not alone.